I was in bed one night, feeling tired from a long day at work. My eyes were getting heavy, and I was ready to fall asleep. The room was dark, with only a sliver of moonlight coming through the curtains. The quietness of the house was comforting. I lived with two housemates, Bernice and Lionel, but they were both out for the night. Bernice had gone to visit her parents, and Lionel was at his girlfriend's place. I was looking forward to having the house all to myself. As I was drifting off, I heard a soft creak from the hallway. My bedroom door was slightly open, and I saw a shadow moving. I figured it was just one of my housemates coming back early, but then something strange happened. The door slowly opened wider, and a head popped in. It was too dark to see clearly, but I could make out the shape of a person. They looked at me for a moment and then quickly pulled back and shut the door. I was more annoyed than scared. They didn't even knock. I decided to get up and see who it was. Maybe Bernice or Lionel had forgotten something and came back. I turned on my bedside lamp, which cast a warm glow in the room, and walked to the door. When I stepped into the hallway, it was completely silent. The house felt empty. I called out, "Bernice, Lionel," but there was no answer. I checked the living room and the kitchen. The lights were off, and there was no sign of anyone. I felt a chill run down my spine. Where had they gone? I went back to my room and grabbed my phone. I texted Bernice first, "Hey, are you home? I thought I saw you a few minutes ago." A few minutes passed with no reply. Then I texted Lionel, "Are you here? I think I saw someone again." No response. I started to feel uneasy. I decided to check the front door. It was locked, just as I had left it. I went to the back door, which was also locked. My mind was racing. If both doors were locked, how did anyone get in? I walked back to the hallway, feeling more nervous with each step. I stood in the hallway, looking around, trying to figure out what to do. Maybe I had imagined it. I was tired, and my mind could have been playing tricks on me, but it felt so real. I decided to check every room just to be sure. I started with Bernice's room. The door was closed, and when I opened it, everything was in its place. Her bed was made, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I moved on to Lionel's room. His door was also closed. I opened it and saw his usual mess of clothes and books, but nothing suggested someone had been there recently. Feeling more anxious, I checked the bathroom and the small storage room. Both were empty. I was starting to doubt myself. Maybe it was just a shadow or my imagination. I went back to my room and sat on the bed. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was nothing, but then I heard it again, a soft creak coming from the hallway. My heart started to race, and I felt a cold sweat on my forehead. I turned off my bedside lamp and listened carefully. The house was so quiet that I could hear my breathing. The creaking sound grew louder, like someone was slowly walking down the hallway. I wanted to get up and check, but fear kept me frozen in place. Suddenly, the door to my room opened slightly, just like before. I could see the shadow of a person standing there. This time, I didn't wait. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. I pointed it at the door, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty. I felt a knot in my stomach. Something was very wrong. I decided to call Bernice. I needed to hear her voice. I dialed her number and waited, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried Lionel next. The phone rang and rang, but he didn't pick up. I left a message, my voice shaking, "Lionel, if you get this, please call me. I think someone's in the house." I didn't know what else to do. I didn't want to call the police and look foolish if it turned out to be nothing, but I also didn't want to stay in the house alone. I decided to wait in my room with the door locked. I pushed a chair against the door for good measure and sat on my bed, holding my phone tightly. Minutes felt like hours as I sat there, listening to every little noise. I kept the flashlight on, pointing it at the door. I kept thinking about the head I saw, the way it looked at me and then disappeared. Who was it? What did they want? Finally, I heard a familiar sound, the front door unlocking. I jumped up, my heart pounding. I heard Lionel's voice calling out. Relief washed over me as I rushed to the door, moving the chair aside and opening it. I found Lionel standing in the hallway, looking confused. "What's going on?" he asked. I told him everything about the head, the sounds, and how scared I was. Lionel listened carefully, then checked the house again with me. We found nothing unusual, no signs of anyone else being there. "Maybe it was just your imagination," Lionel said, trying to reassure me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Even after Lionel went to his room and I tried to go back to sleep, I kept hearing those creaks and seeing that shadow in my mind. I never found out who or what it was that night, but from then on, I always made sure to lock my door and keep a light on. I love babysitting. I've always enjoyed spending time with kids, playing games, and telling them stories. So when the Bridget asked me to babysit their baby boy, Egan, I happily agreed. The Bridget were nice people, and their house was cozy and warm. It was a good way to spend my Saturday evening. I arrived at their house around 6 p.m. Mrs. Bridget showed me around, reminding me of where things were, and gave me the usual instructions: feed Egan dinner at 7 o'clock, play with him for a while, and put him to bed by 8:30. After that, I could watch TV or read until they got back. They expected to be home by 11 p.m. Egan was a happy baby. He giggled and played with his toys while I fed him dinner. After he finished eating, we played in the living room. Egan had a small train set and loved watching the little engine go around the tracks. His laughter filled the room, making me smile. At 8:15, I decided it was time to get Egan ready for bed. I carried him upstairs to his room. The nursery was painted in soft blue colors, with pictures of animals on the walls. A small night light in the shape of a star glowed gently in the corner. I placed Egan in his crib, and he looked up at me with his big, innocent eyes. "Good night, Egan," I said softly, tucking him in. He smiled at me, and I turned to leave the room. Just as I reached the door, Egan spoke. "Who's the lady on the ceiling?" My heart skipped a beat. I turned around slowly, my eyes scanning the ceiling. There was nothing there, just a plain white ceiling. I looked back at Egan, who was still smiling up at me. "There's no one there, Egan," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, but I felt a shiver run down my spine. Egan continued to stare at the ceiling, his smile fading a little. Feeling uneasy, I quickly left the room and closed the door behind me. I stood in the hallway for a moment, trying to calm myself. It was just a baby's imagination, I told myself. Kids say strange things all the time, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I went downstairs and turned on all the lights. The living room felt safe and warm. I turned on the TV and tried to find something to distract myself. A funny movie was playing, so I decided to watch it. I kept glancing at the baby monitor, listening for any sounds from Egan's room, but everything was quiet. After a while, I picked up a book from the coffee table. It was one of Mrs. Bridget's mystery novels. I tried to get into the story, but my mind kept wandering back to what Egan had said. "Who's the lady on the ceiling?" It echoed in my head, making me feel uneasy. I forced myself to focus on the book, trying to ignore the creepy feeling that lingered in the back of my mind. The hours passed slowly. Every creak of the house made me jump, and I kept checking the baby monitor to make sure Egan was still asleep. Finally, at 11 p.m., I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. The Bridget were home. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. When they walked in, I greeted them with a smile, trying to hide my anxiety. "How was everything, Mrs. Bridget asked. "Everything was fine," I replied, not wanting to worry her. "Egan is asleep." They thanked me and paid me for the evening. As I walked home, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The strange feeling stayed with me, making me feel uneasy. I decided I would not babysit at the Bridget house again. The next morning, I got a call from Mrs. Bridget. She thanked me again for babysitting and said Egan had slept through the night without any problems. I didn't mention what Egan had said about the lady on the ceiling. It seemed best to leave it alone. Even now, whenever I think about that night, I get chills. I can still hear Egan's innocent voice asking about the lady on the ceiling. I never found out what he saw, and I never went back to the Bridget house. Babysitting is fun, but some experiences are just too creepy to forget. From that day on, I was more careful about the jobs I took. I always made sure to ask a few extra questions about the house and the kids. It's better to be safe than to end up in another scary situation. But no matter how many years go by, I'll never forget that night with Egan and the lady on the ceiling. It was a cold, rainy night when the stranger walked into our cafe. I had been working the late shift, trying to pass the time by wiping down tables and refilling sugar jars. The usual crowd of night owls and insomniacs were scattered around the place, each absorbed in their own world. The bell above the door jingled, signaling the arrival of a new customer. But this one was different. I looked up, and my heart skipped a beat. The man who walked in was drenched in blood. It soaked his clothes, streaked his face, and dripped from his hands onto the floor. His eyes, however, were calm and clear, as if the blood didn't bother him at all. He walked to the counter and stood there, staring at me for a moment. I couldn't move. I just stared back, my mind racing. Who was he? What had happened to him? Should I call the police? But before I could do anything, he spoke. "I'd like a coffee, please," he said, his voice steady and polite. "And a candy bar." I hesitated, my hand hovering over the phone. His request was so ordinary, so out of place given his appearance. Finally, I managed to speak. "Are you okay?" The man gave a small, almost reassuring smile. "Don't worry," he said. "It's not my blood." Those words sent a chill down my spine. If it wasn't his blood, then whose was it? I didn't dare ask. Instead, I nodded and went about making his coffee. My hands were shaking as I poured the hot liquid into a cup and handed it to him. Then I grabbed a candy bar from the display and placed it next to the coffee. "Thank you," he said, still calm and composed. He took a sip of his coffee and then picked up the candy bar. He stood there for a moment, looking around the cafe. The other customers were starting to notice him too, their conversations dying down as they took in the sight of the blood-soaked stranger. Without another word, He turned and walked out of the cafe, the bell above the door jingling. I watched him through the window as he disappeared into the night, leaving a trail of blood drops behind him. I was left standing there, my mind a whirl of confusion and fear. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting him to come back or for the police to show up asking questions. But neither happened. The customers slowly returned to their conversations, though the atmosphere in the cafe remained tense and uneasy. When my shift finally ended, I couldn't get the stranger out of my mind. I kept replaying the scene over and over, trying to make sense of it. Who was he? Where had he come from? And whose blood had he been covered in? The next day, I scoured the news for any reports of violence or missing persons, but there was nothing. It was as if the man had vanished into thin air, leaving no trace behind. The only evidence that he had ever been in the cafe was the bloodstains on the floor, which I had scrubbed away as best I could. As the days turned into weeks, the memory of the blood-soaked stranger began to fade, though it never completely left me. I started to wonder if I had imagined the whole thing. But the other customers had seen him too. We occasionally exchanged nervous glances, a silent reminder of the night's strange events. Months later, I was working another late shift when a woman walked into the cafe. She seemed normal enough at first, until she approached the counter and handed me a small blood-stained envelope. My heart skipped a beat as I took it from her. "He wanted me to give this to you," she said quietly, her eyes filled with a strange mix of fear and sadness. Before I could ask what she meant, she turned and left, leaving me alone with the envelope. With trembling hands, I opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper, stained with blood and written in a hurried, shaky script. It read, "Thank you for the coffee and the candy bar. I'm sorry for any trouble I caused. I had to do something terrible that night, but it was necessary. The blood was from someone who had to be stopped. You won't hear from me again, but know that you helped make the world a safer place." There was no signature, no indication of who the stranger was or what he had done. I stared at the note, feeling a mix of relief and unease. The mystery was far from solved, but at least I had some small measure of closure. I never saw the blood-soaked stranger again, but I often thought about him, especially on cold, rainy nights. The memory of that night remained with me, a constant reminder that the world is full of mysteries and that sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that have no clear ending. This was like 15 years ago now. When I was a kid, I was with my best friend Conal at some abandoned family resort or bungalow colony type place in New York. It was off a main road and then down a private dirt path driveway entrance. It was a rather large property with a bunch of old abandoned buildings, including at least 10 small bungalows, a main hall, a few bathroom stations, and an indoor pool house. Along with that, there was an outdoor pool, a shuffleboard area, and a kids' playground. Everything was old, run down, and with tall, overgrown grass growing over it. We found this place accidentally one time walking down Route 209, but we didn't explore it that day. We came back another night. By the time we went, it was past sunset, the sun was kissing the sky goodnight. It was getting very dark, but we didn't want to come during the day in fear of getting caught and charged with trespassing. We brought along walkie-talkies and flashlights to communicate with each other when we'd split up. We started looking around the bungalows together. Most of them looked the same and were relatively small, 1 or 2 beds each, a small kitchen, and 1 bathroom each. Some of them had these little living room areas. Halfway through these bungalows, I split off from Conal because he was moving kind of slow. I tried to enter the building that looked to be the main hall or office or something, but every entrance was locked. I walkie-talkied Conal to tell him that the big building was locked, but he didn't walkie-talkie back. I wondered if I was out of range from where he was. 2 minutes later, I found myself at one of the 2 bathroom buildings. It was probably a 400 square foot building. There were no doors to the building, though. It was unusual. It just had 2 big openings, one for the men's room, one for the women's room. I remember the signs being faded and worn out looking. Then, I saw these red tracks on the dirty old concrete bathroom floor. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say they looked like bloody footprints, but I couldn't explain what these red marks could be then, and I still can't say for certain now. Regardless, it was pitch black inside that bathroom around that corner, and that was the first building I was scared to enter. I tried walkie-talking to Conal again, hoping he was in range this time. I pressed the button on the walkie and said, "Yo, where are you?" When I let go, I heard the beep sound that the receiving walkie makes after getting a message from inside the bathroom. It gave me a near heart attack. Then, I thought Conal must already be in there, hence the red-looking footsteps. I called his name, and it echoed into the bathroom. I was actually about to step into the bathroom, thinking he was hiding from me, pranking me, when I heard Conal's voice call out from the distance behind me. Outside in the darkness of the night, I heard him getting closer. I couldn't see him in the dark, but he obviously saw my light, so I yelled back, "I found your walkie-talkie." I started stepping into the bathroom, but then he said back, "Don't go in there." I never went in there. This is when I turned around and hurried right out of there. I pressed and released the talk button really quick on my walkie, causing the beep again from inside that pitch-black women's room. Conal and I looked at each other for half a second and then began dashing in the direction we came. We made it back to Route 209 and had to stop to catch our breaths. This is when Conal told me that inside one of the bungalows he went into, he tried walkie-talking me, but I wasn't answering, meaning we must have been out of range. But then he heard a noise from the living area of the bungalow. As he turned around, his flashlight revealed an older woman almost running towards him. He dropped his walkie-talkie and flashlight and ran out from the bungalow. He ran in the dark and hid, refraining from making noise in fear of being followed. He hid for a questionable amount of time before looking around and seeing my flashlight across the field over at the bathrooms. The most likely explanation to me was that some cracked-out drug addict was hiding or living in that abandoned bungalow. For whatever reason, she lunged at Conal and picked up his walkie-talkie. What she was doing in that bathroom, who knows, maybe drugs, maybe the bathroom in the bungalow didn't work. But what I don't know is why there was a trail of what looked like blood in there. Those are my theories, but I can't explain all of it away, and that's the scariest part. Thanks for watching the video. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to watch the latest videos.